All right, guys, this is the seventh installment of our podcast on the aesthetic education of man by Friedrich Schiller. Wow, it's going to be a doozy, like they always are. And I think, like I always do, I have a little bit of a preamble, but I notice that it's sometimes good to sort of see the floor up front. So maybe, CJ, was there anything from last podcast that you kind of left you scratching your head, or something you wanted to
No, I
start
think
off?
what was really fascinating is that we did get a lot of work done, and I think it would be of service maybe to look at it again and try to have those different ideas that Schiller proposed in those letters that we looked at and kind of have those maybe in the forefront of my mind. I think I kind of forgot about what we talked about in some sense, but at the same time, I think I remember what we did talk about was very illuminating, and that I think nothing was really leaving me in questions. It was more just kind of wanting to continue with those ideas. So there wasn't really a question. It was more kind of an invitation, if you will. So yeah. I think I'm totally fine.
I think we did a pretty good job last time. Aside from the fact that we actually didn't cover the 21st letter, I actually managed to skip over that. But we ended up having an hour-long podcast anyway, so I don't think I needed to cram it in. So today we're going to cover letters 21 through 24. The only thing that I would add is not so much a correction from what we did last time, but an insight. And
okay.
You know, in last podcast, one of the big revelations that we had was that we could sort of Punnett square the different types of artificial and natural men based on the type of tenseness or lethargy that they had, right? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about this, because what I do after I do our podcast, like the next day or something like that, I'll put on the headphones and go walking in the field. And it struck me is how similar that description of all those individuals within that Punnett square is really to the different types of aesthetes in the Kierkegaardian existential stage theory. And what's striking about this is that Kierkegaard was very familiar with systematizing Hegel, right? And he would, I think it stands to reason that he would also be familiar with sort of an acolyte of German idealism, or a contemporary of Hegel, someone who was very much caught up in this philosophical trend. It's likely, and I'm just purely speculating here, it's likely that Kierkegaard was aware of Schiller. And I wonder if this description that Schiller does make of the different types of artificial and natural men and their tenseness and their laxity and stuff like that, I wonder if that would go on to affect a major part of the existential program that Kierkegaard would take up in his own work.
I don't think it's that far of a guess, because if I recall, didn't Hegel have a piece that was talking about, I think it was like Fichte, I can't even remember the guy's name.
Fichte, yeah.
Fichte and Schiller, there was like some kind of essay or book or treatise that he had that was about Fichte and Schiller. So I think
Hegel does praise Schiller at
where there's like this there's this concept that I can't remember what he was talking about there, but there's this thing where he includes Schiller and he talks about Schiller. So I think either by proxy or by actual research or actual looking into the text, I think Kierkegaard probably would have dived into Schiller. But granted, too, I don't know what translations were available. I don't even know if he spoke German.
Right. So I
don't know. I mean,
well, we'll just put that out there, that if it has not been done, that would be a research topic for someone to take up in their master's thesis, their dissertation, or publish in some journal or something like that. But I think the similarities are pretty striking.
No, I think it continues on that thesis. I don't even know if it is a thesis that we're having, but through all these podcasts, is that philosophy is just one big conversation with thousands of people, and that they all kind of build up on each other, what each other's saying. Maybe some take what somebody's saying and contradicts it. Maybe others take what somebody's doing and put a new spin on it, and then somebody takes that new spin and puts a new spin on that, and then somebody takes that new spin on a new spin and argues about that and says, no, that's not right. Let me go back to that first spin that he took. You know what I mean? Like, it's all this...
The ultimate sampling project. The ultimate hip-hop collage.
Yeah, that's what it kind of seems to be, at least to me, especially with something that can be as conceptual and as abstract as philosophy. I think it's kind of cool where you can see... And maybe that's another way to look at education, or maybe like a way to look at philosophy, or like a history of philosophy, is just taking ideas and maybe just seeing core. I'm sure people do that already.
There is like a whole sort of discipline, and depending on who you would ask, right? So we're getting into the realm of intellectual history.
Is that like a history of ideas?
History of ideas.
Yeah.
And some people, I actually think that is a form of philosophy, to sort of speculate on sort of the germination, evolution, and synthesis of different ideas. And I mean, really, when we're talking about people like Hegel, we're talking about someone who really was doing the history of ideas. Like I'll mention this today as we get towards the end of the podcast, with Schiller's very faint musings on religion, that sort of maybe fed into some of the Hegelian understanding of the unfolding of spirit in time, and how certain religious ideas become, so that they sort of naturally evolve over time. But we should probably get into the text a little bit.
But I think maybe a final thought.
Oh, sure.
To continue with that, and maybe to just to kind of put a period at it, is that no philosopher exists in a vacuum.
Right.
That's what I think we're kind of getting at.
Totally.
Which is so cool, is that we can just kind of see where all this big tree of philosophy. But let's continue on this branch and see where we can go.
I imagine that's not going to be the only parallel that comes out of this.
No,
in the course of this conversation.
Let's see what kind of parallels we can make.
Yeah, let's see what happens. So, in talking about the 21st letter, this will sort of end up being a refresher of what we did last podcast. And the thing remember last podcast we talked a lot about active and passive determinability, and we talked about empty infinity, how like that if there wasn't sort of the active determination of what the sense apparatus sort of naturally receives through the sense organs or whatnot, if there wasn't a concept limiting it, you couldn't have a reality, because you just have this manifold presented to experience that you couldn't apply concepts to, right? Well, in the 21st letter, he starts to talk about aesthetic determinacy, okay? And this is going to be unlike the active determinacy that goes about carving up the reality of like everyday experience. It just happens instantaneously like that. Aesthetic determinacy, and I have a hard time understanding it, but
what can you surmise from it? Yeah.
I have some notes here, but I'm going to try to expound from them. But I wrote down, not determined exclusively, unlimited because of the inclusion of all realities, and this is hard for me to understand, because I don't want to pitch the wrong metaphor. And a lot of it's going to be coming from Kant's critique of pure judgment too, is that you have concepts involved, but there's an unlimitedness to it, right? Mm-hmm. And it ultimately culminates in what he calls filled infinity. So the way that I try to understand this, at least in Kant's critique of judgment, I've had it sort of described in two ways, and I'm not enough of a Kant scholar to say with certainty the way it is, and we're not covering Kant, but I've heard the critique of judgment described like this, is that and when you behold something beautiful, you have, the imagination has these sense impressions, but it doesn't have a concept for them all, and it gives rise to a sort of pleasurable feeling of the beautiful. I've also heard it described as if the manifold of sense impressions can't fit under a concept entirely. Whereas like if I look at this chair diagonally, to me, I'm like, chair, not beautiful, fits underneath my concept. Whereas I look at this piece of art behind me or something like that, I have a concept for this artwork behind me. And if anyone can see it, well, you can't really see it, but if you've seen enough of these on YouTube or whatever, it's a naked woman, right? Right?
Maybe not YouTube, but
it's a drawing of a naked woman, right? And like I have a concept for a naked woman, but like it's done with such detail that the way that I sort of understand this, though, the analogy that I use, it's like if the concept is a cup, the aesthetic determinacy, the sense of unlimitedness, the filled infinity, I imagine concepts and reality coming together in the sense of experiencing the beauty. It's like when you just keep pouring water into a cup and it just spills over. It's just like too much sense data for the concept to properly subsume it all under it. And it's in that process that like we have this balancing of the formal and the sensual aspect of things, and that's sort of how we get this feeling of beauty within us. Now, I don't know. What do you think about that metaphor?
I mean, this is kind of going into, maybe I'm getting ahead, but I think what you're describing is how Schiller views what's a good work of art.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, that would be well, we've talked about this would be the rational concept of beauty.
Yeah.
It would be something that's so what's the word? I mean, it's so multifaceted. The thing that you're beholding,
complete. That it doesn't just appeal to your reason, but it also appeals to your senses as well. I think that's what he's talking about. At least how I grasped it was that a work of art was something that you could, at one end, think of it sensually, and you could, at another end, think of it rationally or within form, and that it encompasses both of those, and it allows you to have the freedom to look at it in both ways. And that for Schiller, if a piece of art maybe makes you more attuned to sensuality, and yet when you look at it through this, formal lens, you don't get much out of it, then no, that's not really like aesthetically pleasing, beautiful art. So it's this really odd thing where it's almost this, it's not a negation, but like you said, I guess like Schiller says, it's sort of this infinity where it's almost like, have you heard of the idea of the Aleph? It's this thing where it's like, it's one thing, but there's one point in time, or this one little object, but it encompasses everything. So you just look into the object and you see everything at the same time. Universe, infinity, everything.
Can you give an example of that?
There's a short story by Jorge Luis Borges it's called The Aleph, and this guy's like, Borges, the author, he's strolling around one day, and he has a friend who's a poet. And the poet's like, man, I mean, I might be getting the story wrong, but he's like, man, I have this cool thing that lets me make all this cool poetry and get all these references and gives me inspiration. And he's like, okay, what was it? He's like, it's this thing called the Aleph. It's like, I can't remember what ideology it comes from, or whether it's based on some kind of religious relic or some kind of thing, but it's essentially infinity. All things meet in this point. And he's like, huh, interesting. So Borges goes to the guys, he's like, yeah, I'll show it to you, come to my house. So he comes to his house, and the guy says, come down to my basement and put your feet up at the bottom of the stairs, and I'll close the door and you'll see it. And Borges does it, and he's like, oh my God, I'm going to get killed. Like this is just like some trick to get me murdered.
Yeah.
And then he does it, and then there's just this description, which is almost just like this collage of all these things. He's like, oh, I see, maybe I'm just going to wax poetic here. I'm just going to improvise. I don't really know what he said, but he's like, oh man, I see Caesar getting assassinated. I see, King Kong, movie. He sees all these different things that, just make no sense together, but it's just like the universe, time past and time even in the future.
He's kind of getting like a God's eye view of eternity.
But all in one thing. And then at the end, then he has this experience. But I guess it's almost like this sense where it's like, it's not really I guess Schiller is trying to say a work of art, not saying a work of art encompasses everything like an Aleph sort of thing, but
I think he might be saying something like that.
Maybe that's what he's saying.
I'm not saying a work of art gives us this glimpse into God's eternality or something like that, but it does maybe gives us a look into its own sort of universe that is totally unlimited in some way. For instance, if you look at a statue, okay. So let's say we're telling a story about David and Goliath, right? Mm-hmm. And the statue is the moment right before David lets the stone release from his slingshot, right? Or maybe it's right before the rock embeds itself in Goliath's like brow or whatever. It's this frozen moment, but like it projects when it's received into the mind or whatever. It projects out this infinite story. It's this one time slice that gives us sort of like a concept or whatever, but then it explodes in all these different directions.
Do you think it connects to this idea of timelessness that Schiller?
Well, I actually have that in my notes.
Yeah,
if you look at my notes,
no, I just asked a question.
Yeah, I don't know. See, that's the thing I'm trying to figure out here, and I think I'm really glad that we have you to talk about this, because I think it really relates to how we get like caught up in like a musical performance, and like if we're really engaged in like a symphony or something like that, like we just get lost in it. I was watching videos of Ian Curtis from Joy Division last night doing his sort of epilepsy dance that he was doing, and like how he would just get lost in the music, or how we get lost. And I wonder if if I don't think this is a mechanical causal explanation, but the idea that the work of art can explode, or these vessels that are the categories of the mind or whatever, if that's what causes the sense of timelessness.
And also maybe too, I think what you're also touching upon is how it explodes, and what Schiller talks about further in this letter, how it explodes even the form of the art itself.
Right.
Which is a totally other kind of concept where, if I remember, or maybe you were going to say something?
Well, no, I'm trying to understand. Right? And this is total wild speculation, because like I think maybe Schiller...
That's all this is, man.
Yeah, I think like Schiller may take a lot of it for granted or whatever. So if we're presented with like normal everyday objects that allow us to have like a workable reality that allows us to like get to work on time, and file paperwork, and cash our paycheck, and like eat food, and all that boring everyday stuff or whatever. But then we have this experience of aesthetic determinacy. Like if the sensuousness is overflowing the concepts, if it starts to mess with our sense of time, because we know from like the little bit of Kant that we've gone back into that space and time are not parts of the universe, right? Space and time for Kant are going to be things that are part of the I don't know how to properly say it, maybe the rational schematization of the universe. It's dependent on the individual, but because we're all sort of constituted the same, there's intersubjective objectivity. What I wonder is when we have an art object that properly balances the formal and sensual impulses and leads to this overflowing thing, if it messes with our basic understandings of space and time and accounts for why when we experience a symphony or make music or gaze at a statue or something like that, if that's what makes it so we just get lost in it so much and we lose track of time, and like 2 hours feels like 2 minutes.
Maybe that's where the Aleph kind of comes back in, where it is kind of this overwhelming, just like, if you think of that idea of everything, like infinity meeting onto one space. That kind of overwhelming sensation, I think, is what maybe Schiller is talking about.
I think we've established a correlation. I just don't know how it does it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so it's interesting, though. I don't know if this is letter 25 or 24, or maybe he doesn't say this, but if I recall, Schiller emphasizes form as one of the things he says. To be beautiful, he says, like, as much as like also sensuality is important, the object needs to have form.
Yeah.
Because if there is, form has to be the main thing. Where maybe
he talks about annihilating matter. Yeah.
Yeah, where it's like maybe you need form first. Like if you just had both kind of overflow, like maybe I don't know if he's. Well, do you think he's advocating this kind of overflow of just like because that almost seems kind of irrational, kind of crazy, not this. I think it's aesthetic sense of beauty.
I think it's an uneasy sort of balance or whatever. I don't think
perhaps do you think maybe it's like a a controlled kind of chaos, like how we can
I think it's more like that.
Like we can split an atom in that we contain this. Like if we shifted it just one bit, that we could cause this huge explosion.
I think it's more
but
like
that we can kind of control this.
Yeah, I think
chaos. So I guess maybe that's.
Yeah, I think it's probably like a super collider or something like that.
Yeah,
like art is like a super collider of some sort. I do want to get to that. I think that concern comes up in like the next letter or two, and I want to because the thing I want to go back to this idea of what form is, and I have to go back to that. The only other thing I wanted to say here that I thought was relevant from letter 21 was he talks about, and we know this already. We've sort of beaten this dead horse about how the art object sort of creates this balance between the formal and sensual aspects, and restores the humanity of man, and sort of creates this second nature, right? So they're returning us to some sort of Edenic, pre-fall, pre-modernization state, and so and you have to kind of wonder, like, I don't know if Schiller doesn't strike me as a particularly religious man, but like if he thinks that instead of Adam and Eve where the garden was, it was the Greeks, right? And the Greeks, because he talked early on in the podcast, the Greeks they didn't have their mind sort of as parceled up as the modern mind as the result of modern industry, modern machinery, modern socioeconomic, modern monarchical systems. He thinks the Greeks had their minds were more unified, and I wonder if he thinks that when we go to the aesthetic condition, we are sort of in communion with the Greeks.
I think what's interesting about that, just saying the Greeks too, is that you have to think of the two. Like if you take the Greeks, you kind of put them into two groupings. You got Athens, and then you got Sparta. So which one would he be for? Well, I would think he would be for Athens, at least for more well-rounded. Like if you think of Sparta, might be a more kind of.
Yeah, I think Sparta. I mean,
strikes me as a more maybe aggressive sensuality of sorts. I mean, this is a debate that's so many philosophers at least have said like, oh, Athens or Sparta, what was the best one? It's interesting because I think like at least some. I don't know. Would you count Rousseau as one of his contemporaries?
Schiller?
Yeah.
I mean,
romantic, like sort of around the same time, more or less.
Well, the thing is like that raises an interesting question about what a contemporary is, because I don't have the dates in front of me. So even if they were temporal contemporaries, I mean, I think Schiller is invoking. He alludes to how philosophers are rallying around this idea of a state of nature that obviously is
that's what I mean. Yeah, at least that's what I think of. Like when I think of Rousseau, as like somebody who would be closer to Sparta, where it's just like, yeah, these guys they're not totally obsessed by abstract concepts and stuff. They're all just about just.
Yeah, but you can tell he actually. He's very suspect of that idea of there actually being a state of nature. He's like, he'll say very frequently throughout the text that place doesn't really exist, and I wonder if he's having a little fun with Rousseau. But I'm not sure when Rousseau was publishing in
no, but I think that idea. I mean, like you said, even contemporaries, or even like we're saying, like ideas, right? I don't think that idea of the noble savage at least started or stopped with Rousseau. So I think maybe. That's something, but
kicking around there for a while.
Kicking around, even if it's in different guises. But I think that's something to consider too. Is that maybe if you do say in Eden, maybe he was thinking Athens as in Eden.
Yeah, and that's going to come into play.
Or Hellenic Greece.
I think that's going to come into play in maybe letter 23. I think so.
Okay.
So in letter 22, I mean, we've kind of covered a lot of what I was going to say about it.
Mm-hmm.
We've covered some of the concepts of timelessness and things like that. But just to kind of rehash what we've talked about in previous podcasts, and maybe we've already said it a little bit here, but the experience of beauty sort of allows us to both be serious and playful at the same time. It allows us to have strength and rigor and also sort of frivolity at the same time. If something is the rational concept of beauty, it's appealing to both sides of our nature.
Yeah.
And when the play impulse is orchestrated, where we have these relaxing and intensifying operations that are going on within the play impulse as a result of the coordination of the formal and sensual impulses, you have liberty from the sensual, where you're no longer externally determined by, you're not being led around like a dumb animal following a carrot or something like that. You have freedom from that because the formal part of you is properly engaged. And further, you're not, excessively intellectual and all the problems that go along with that because you're reconnected with your sensuality. But I think he gets here first. He gets us to this idea again that so in this freedom, right, we are going to be allowed to finally determine ourselves. We're going to finally be allowed to self-legislate. We're going to finally be able to give ourselves the Kantian moral law. All right.
But so the just state.
Yeah, and give us, and by extension, political freedom. And he's going to get into it a little bit later, but he digresses just for a little bit, because he's going to say in the next letter, and I want to dwell on this when we get to it, that because you're in this place of aesthetic freedom because you're in the aesthetic condition. Okay, why are you going to be moral? He's going to say there are certain sublime situations that push us towards morality, and we're going to address that here, but I want to make sure I cover this stuff first because I thought this is pretty interesting. But I have to make some theorizing about what he means by sublime situation. But something that was super interesting that he says in letter 22 that I don't think we should gloss over is that he says that we are assuming here that art forms are monolithic in their ability to trigger the aesthetic condition in every individual. Mm-hmm. That, beautiful piece of music. Oh, beautiful architecture, beautiful painting. I'm experiencing beauty. Look at me. I'm blissed out. I'm free. I'm gonna be a good person.
Yeah.
But he says that certain art forms are sort of going to be necessarily closer to one's impulse over the other.
Sure.
Music, he says, is by nature closer to sensuality, right?
And that if you try to think formally afterwards, you'd be like, music doesn't help for me.
I wonder if we have refuted or proved his point on that. Because he says it's not as close to intellection, so maybe when you and I go down in the basement, make music, we get get our sensuality all going in that art form, mm-hmm. that it actually is more difficult to engage in intellection after that.
Well, it's
than
interesting.
before.
Yeah,
I don't know. What do you think?
Throughout history, there's different. I think I brought up this little quip before, but there's this 12-tone serialist composer named Alvin Berg, and I'll call him 12-tone romantic sort of. I don't really know how to describe him, but he was a pupil of a guy named Arnold Schoenberg who adopted this 12-tone method, which is known as a kind of cerebral form of making music, because you take the 12 notes that are in a music scale and you sort of create an arrangement of them that's almost kind of like a democratic arrangement of these things, and then you use that row throughout your piece. You can stack it horizontally, you can create a retrograde of the row, and then maybe form it horizontally. You can, to form chords and stuff. So you have to kind of keep this row going, but it's almost kind of like a mathematical sort of way of looking at music where there's not really kind of expressing yourself or anything, but it's mm-hmm. more kind of this. And Berg took this idea into his own music, and he also kind of reflected romantic inflections as well, but he had this little quip in a letter, and he was talking to a friend, and he's like, a lot of people tell me that, and I think I've said this before to you, and maybe in another podcast or maybe in private, but he's writing a letter to his friends. A lot of people say that music is this ecstasy of emotion, or maybe in Schiller's sense, people think it's just sensual side, that it's just this ecstasy of sensuality, but he's like, what, this music we're doing, and what I think music really is, it's an ecstasy of logic.
Yeah, I remember you saying that.
Where it's this ecstasy of formal elements, and maybe that saying it maybe goes into what Schiller thinks beauty, or at least artworks that are in a form encapsulate, that they encapsulate all these other forms together, right? We're saying like, almost like how we're saying that artism is a good art or beauty can just like put all of these things, the sensual, the formal into one, that a piece of music that is quote unquote beautiful, I guess to Schiller, would even defy music. It would be musical, but then it would also take in all these other kind of influence, be like a painting, it'd be like a sculpture, it'd be like architecture. I mean, I think it's kind of funny, at least.
Yeah, I mean, is that kind of what happens when we listen to a piece of music? Like when we go, I especially think about it in classical music, because I think it's excessively difficult, and maybe not for you, but for me.
Probably
right?
For me too.
But for me, it's very hard for me to conceptualize a piece of classical music, even if I know it well. Like, even if it's a piece that I've listened to over and over again. And so, maybe the reason why I have that sense of timelessness when I'm in a piece of classical music, or any piece of classical music, is that there's so many concepts being deployed to try to rein in the sensuousness of this beautiful piece of music, that none of them quite do the job. Like, none of them can quite get it done. And then before, just as it's trying to conceptualize where we are in the piece of music, the movement that it's in or whatever, then the music takes another turn. And I want to say this, I have a hard time finding a lot of pop music to be really beautiful, especially now, because it's so easily conceptualizable.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe it encapsulates either sensuality or form, or maybe it's just so ingrained in musical ideals or the musical form that you can't, or maybe form, it's so encapsulated in form where it's like, okay, verse, chorus.
I feel like I know how the song is going to go.
Hook, bridge,
I'm like,
know the structure,
with pop music, you give me 20 seconds of a pop song, I'm like, okay, I know how it's going to go. Next song,
right?
Like that's how my brain is working now. But I can't do that with classical music.
Sure, or maybe you would find the structure in a classical music
if I was properly trained, maybe.
Or if you listen to it a lot, you're like, okay, it's gonna get you to that point now, or it's gonna if it's this kind of style, or if it's this kind of thing, you kind of have.
Well, it raises
a formal structure, or formal prejudices, I guess.
Well, then this raises a very interesting point that I don't think we can fully address right now, because there's a lot of there's still development of the ideas that we have to do. But can something precipitate the aesthetic condition and beauty within us at one time? So let's say I find we use Stravinsky's Rites of Spring a lot. We use that as an example or whatever. I find that to be beautiful. You may not, or it gives me the aesthetic condition. You may not. But let's say I go in and get your conservatory education, and I can so easily conceptualize it that it's as easily discernible to me as, say, like a Taylor Swift top 40 hit, something like that. Do objects that are the rational concept of beauty, right? Are they just beautiful to one particular time in our life, or do they retain their beauty throughout our lives? For instance, I use in my lecture series, I use the example of Joyce's Ulysses, and Joyce's Ulysses has you can read that thing on so many layers, and the reason why there are Joycean scholars is that it's like 3D checkers or 3D chess. Like people are doing all sorts of moves, and they get so much aesthetic sort of satisfaction out of it, they can't ever properly sort of conceptualize it. And it's like this unending source of filled infinity. And I wonder if something that precipitates the aesthetic condition will always precipitate the aesthetic condition, regardless of how old we are, how mature our tastes go, or can something that precipitated the aesthetic condition at one time in our life then become banal to us later and not move us at all?
But do you think that has something to do with the object itself, or that has something to do with us? Because
it has to do with us.
I think that's...
It has to do entirely with us, because beauty is in us, not in the object.
Do you think you've solved that question then?
Well, I think that's what Schiller...
where it's just... he spends a lot of time talking about diagnosing, the human condition and how it receives art and stuff like that. So I think maybe it's not so much the art object, if it is truly beautiful, that we almost have to. And I don't know what you may. I'd be curious what you think about this. Maybe like for an art, we have to approach an art object on its own merit. We have to rise to that aesthetic condition. Would that be something?
I don't know. I mean,
because maybe when we have an education, we lose that aesthetic condition.
I mean, yeah, you could say that the education actually is not an education; it's a miseducation.
Yeah.
You could say,
Ooh.
yeah. I mean, you could say that if, for instance, if you ever start to find Michelangelo's David uninteresting, or if you ever start to find Ulysses uninteresting, or if you ever and let's say you go get a PhD in these things. You go get a PhD in art history. You go get a PhD in literature or whatever else. And like you are just at the mountaintops and you're like, Ulysses is nothing to me. I'm writing something even better than Ulysses. Or like Michelangelo, dilettante. I will surpass him, right? or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if Schiller would say, no. It's not you that is superior. You have actually regressed. You have actually been taken off course by the excessively formal, and I need to reintroduce you to the true things. And that's why there are certain works of art that endure throughout the centuries, why people of every generation find them beautiful over and over and over and over again.
And I think what you're touching on, which is something that is quite fascinating, I think is worthy of note, is that when we find a piece that is aesthetically beautiful and we admire it and our life is changed by that we almost have to keep that aesthetic condition alive with that piece in some way or another, with that piece of art, or maybe with ourselves. Do you think it's more having to do with the relationship with ourselves that we have to change? Or do you think maybe, okay, in order to find Michelangelo's David constantly beautiful, aesthetically beautiful, I have to look at it both formally and sensually, and then maybe like some days it's a little more sensually and some days it's a little more formally.
Yeah,
but like keep this constant balance. Or if it's something that's just like within myself, it'd be like, man, I gotta be less sensual, man. Honestly, man, like I'm too formal for this shit. I need to get a little more of that sensual thing going. That's what I'm curious about, whether it's more with an art piece that we have to do this balance, or more with ourselves, or maybe both.
I think the art piece calibrates ourselves. I think that's what Schiller is trying to say,
okay.
is that regardless of where you are in that Punnett square of individuals, so let's say you're the relaxed artificial man, and then you become the relaxed sensual man or natural man or something like that. Michelangelo's David will affect you differently depending where you are in there, but it's ultimately going to get you to the aesthetic condition the same. Okay. It's going to be like a tuning fork or something something that tunes an instrument. You know what I'm saying? And I want to get to that concept and dwell on it a little bit more. I just want to say a little bit more about this. He says that sculpture is closer to the intellect than the sensual, which I thought was pretty interesting. It's more close to form. But then he says ultimately the fact that music may be closer to the sensual, sculpture may be closer to the intellect or form. It doesn't matter, because guess what he says? He says all the art forms are converging to where they're meeting. All of them are naturally sort of going to the point where they're all in the middle, where they are a balance of formal and sensual. So that music is becoming more formal, and sculpture is becoming more sensual.
I think it's very fascinating that Schiller's contemporary and friend Goethe said, there's such a beautiful description of music. He said, like, good music, or just music in general, is moving architecture And just like, oh, that's so cool because like,
what do you think that means? What do you think that means? Help me understand, because I'm trying to understand form and what.
Because I think maybe what he's saying, maybe it's like more like sensual. I mean, at least how we're talking, I think that's just a perfect way to kind of take like, oh, it's combining all these different art forms. Where it's like architecture and music, or music is like architecture.
It is like a blueprint animated, isn't it?
It's sort of, yeah, when you think of it that way, where I guess is where it's like, it is the sensual side and the formal side kind of coming together and not even know if you want to call it a marriage, but this kind of
interaction.
Yeah, dare I say interaction, or just not craziness, but just kind of like you said, just kind of converges. Again, it's like converges into this Aleph that just combines everything together, and that even too, this almost kind of alludes back to Nietzsche when he said that tragedy, or at least verse, kind of tries to mimic music. Now, granted, we don't have to include the whole thing where it's like everybody's trying to imitate music, but I think the idea that other art forms get influenced by other art forms, I think that's something that's very timely even today, maybe something we always have to constantly remind ourselves, because sometimes we get so indoctrinated into like, I'm a musician, so I do music, that we don't think of how other art forms might influence us. Or maybe even as philosophers. I don't know if you feel as a philosopher, sometimes you just think as a philosopher that you can't be influenced maybe by other writings or poetry or music. I mean, you're a different case though.
Yeah, I'm kind of weird.
But maybe you can speak to then how music has affected your philosophy, or maybe your philosophy has become more like music. Maybe you've included the sensual in your formal kind of thinking. Maybe
that's a whole.
Is that a whole other discussion?
That's a whole other discussion. I mean, I'm willing to have it, but I think it's a whole other discussion, and we're kind of halfway through where we need to go. I'm not against it, but I mean, I think I am sort of an individual that brings a lot of influences into the way that I do philosophy. Like, it may not be obvious, but like the way that I go about composing this podcast is not unlike how I compose a song. In the way that I speak, I'll notice, like when I sort of do my recorded lectures or whatever, there's a rhythmic cadence in it. I found myself sort of tapping my foot to it as well, like so that even unconsciously it will bleed into it. And then I enjoy. I mean, me personally, I draw from a lot of poetical texts. I draw from a lot of religious texts. And there are a lot of philosophers that would eschew both those things. Like, I'm
sure if you're driving from sermons, you're like, oh, wow,
yeah. A lot. I mean,
whatever.
A lot of philosophers have no use for things like sermons, and I think sermons are really beautiful art forms.
Oh yeah. Especially if you get like I can't remember if it was like 18th century or 17th century, like especially like Jonathan Edwards or any kind of like really old school kind of evangelists that like really like they are studied in the classics and they know rhetoric like so well, and they can just go argument to argument to argument, like with just like, whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful. And you and I were talking at dinner how there's sort of because in the other podcast with Jordan, I'm doing Augustine and how he was trained in rhetoric and how people aren't trained in rhetoric, and I think how this has hurt the discipline of philosophy because we don't have enough engaging personalities in philosophy to sort of really excite people and stir their emotions up about the discipline.
And it's interesting though, and you mentioned rhetoric as well, because Bach was really influenced by the idea of rhetoric as well, that he used, I can't remember what the tripartite sort of, how they taught rhetoric, I can't remember what the tripartite, they had this like three-pronged model of how rhetoric was supposed to be taught, or at least what it included, and that Bach used these in his own works and in his studies as a musician and in teaching his kids and other students as well. Using speech, using rhetoric as a form to help his own music and maybe to serve as an analogy. But I think it goes back to, again, I mean, maybe Schiller is just a long-winded way to say that holistic thinking maybe is not the only way, but is a really important thing in anybody's creative endeavors.
Yeah, I mean that's
sort of the long-winded way to say. I mean, it took us maybe
well, I would say
6 hours to get to that point.
But that's a really major takeaway. I mean, I would say if anybody walks away from this text, I mean, the first thing when we kicked off this podcast, I would say I thought this was really great for artists in the sense that it legitimizes their pursuits from a political freedom perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk about essentially what he's trying to do is unify the mind and restore humanity. I mean, that's all. If someone asks you what the point of this book is, it's to make us whole again.
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating, and maybe it goes into what we've been talking about, is that he doesn't necessarily try to divide up the mind. He wants to bring it all together.
He has to locate the faculties in order to make that.
Yeah, the faculty in order to make it whole. He doesn't want to, because I think maybe a lot of people think, oh, well, maybe we have to balance them out. And he's like, no, you don't have to. We're not trying to balance them. We're trying to make each go to its fullest capacity. Wait, I don't know. Do you think it is balancing? Because I feel like it's more just 110% for sensuality, 110% for form, and they're trying to bring everything, like you said, the overflow of water sort of thing.
I think. I mean, the thing is, I think it's both. I think there's sort of this balance in the aesthetic experience, the proper one, where we have the free disposition. I think there is this sort of dynamic balancing tension between the formal and the sensual aspects and things like that. But then at the same time, that's within consciousness, that seems to be sort of a subset of processes that are occurring, and hence why there's still room within consciousness for moral and political activity to occur. And we have to talk about that sublime situation, that specifically, and how that relates to it. The only thing I wanted to really say here is, for Schiller, we've talked about these different art forms. Right. Unlike Nietzsche had big problems with people like Euripides because they were trying to be didactic and slip certain content in, moralizing stories and things like that. For Schiller, it doesn't really matter what the artist chooses to work his art upon. It's its ability. Well, it is form. Yeah. It's the marriage of form to matter. But that marriage of form and matter, all that matters in that marriage of form and matter is the precipitation of the aesthetic condition. So if we're talking about Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Hamlet, David and Goliath, Soviet Union, it does not matter what the particulars are. It doesn't matter what the story is. What really matters is its ability to set off this free condition of aesthetic freedom, of aesthetic determinacy.
I think that's really important in the sense that maybe sometimes we view pieces of work that aren't... So, I like to think that sometimes artwork, not all artwork is meant to be quote-unquote maybe what we think is superficially beautiful, but I think that which can activate maybe a sensual... So where maybe a Rite of Spring, maybe people don't think that is... beautiful, quote unquote. No, I mean beautiful in a superficial, we think as Mozart as beautiful. But both of those do activate sensual and formal, granted in different ways. But even if it doesn't maybe take up a superficial sense of what beauty is, maybe if it appears ugly, it can still activate both, the sensual and the formal, which I think is maybe very revelatory. Maybe not. You think?
Well, see, the thing I use the Rite of Spring because I love it so much, but I'm not sure the fact that I love it means that it is the ideal concept of beauty for Schiller. I'm not sure Schiller would say, you know what, Stravinsky is a great example of someone who...
Yeah, well, you had to get in a time machine first, but no, I know.
I mean, I think it's probably more likely that Schiller would find someone like Mozart to precipitate this aesthetic condition than Stravinsky, if I had to hedge my bets.
Oh, sure. No, I understand.
So, and that's a big question we have to, because he doesn't really give us any examples.
No. Though I'm curious, though, maybe it'd be future homework if we can find texts.
Well, that's what I want to do.
Find correspondence where he gives yeah, man, that concert I saw of Beethoven was really cool.
Well, he obviously had admiration for Goethe. I mean, he must have thought Goethe got something right.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so,
I mean, because isn't that? I mean, if I remember in one of the footnotes, he kind of says like, "Yeah, I've been kind of basing this ideal guy off of you, Johann. Like, I hope that's okay. I hope that's all right. That I'm basically talking about you right now. I'm kind of fanboying about you, but it's kind of in philosophical diction. But I know you know that I'm like, this is like my." Thumbs up. This is like my rap music. This is like my kind of tribute where it's just like, yeah, well, this goes out to Goethe, my home. You know what I mean? Where it's like they kind of include that. You know what I mean? Like, rest in peace, Five Dog, man. This is for all the slain rappers out there. You know what I mean? Like, this is like his sort of version of that.
That is awesome.
Maybe, I don't know. That's what it seems like, which is kind of cool. Where it's like, I mean, again, we're talking about a network of ideas, or like a network of music, whether that be in hip hop or classical music. Like, there are nods everywhere to other people. Where this is kind of, maybe this is kind of his nod to a dear friend and a great artist, and a great human being like Goethe. I mean.
Yeah, I feel like I have to get to know Goethe better. I mean, all I've read is Faust, and I have to say, I had the most interesting experience reading Faust, because when I was reading it, and anyone listening to this, I make sure to heed these words. I got to like 3/4 of the way through Faust, and I was like, why is this? This isn't good, and the beauty of Faust was totally lost on me. And I got so frustrated, and I was like, see how dumb this is? And then I started reading it aloud, like, angrily. I'm like, that doesn't even make sense. And I'm reading it, and then my ears are hearing my voice. And I'm like, oh, it's beautiful. And
so is this your sublime moment?
Maybe, but what I'm trying to say here is, the thing that everybody should heed is, that poem, that epic poem, or whatever, are not meant to be read. It was meant to be heard.
It's like Shakespeare, where some people are like, man, I can't understand Shakespeare.
You gotta experience it.
You have to hear it, experience it. I didn't even think about how like something like No Fear Shakespeare or something like that kind of destroys the poetry of the work, where sometimes, like you said, like, it's all about how you read it. Or I guess maybe, that's another kind of thing to take in too, is how you actually take in the piece of work.
Yeah. Well, I just got a notification on the computer saying that the disk's full.
Okay.
I don't want to waste any of our conversation, so I'm going to stop it here.
Okay.
And we'll pick it right back up after I figure out my computer situation.
All right, sounds good.
All right.